The day started like any other, except it would end up being the day I realized how little people actually know about the lives they judge. I had been living a simple life, working at the local library, riding a beaten-up bicycle to get around, wearing clothes that were neat but far from trendy. Friends of my family, distant relatives, even neighbors, would look at me with that thinly veiled smirk, as if my quiet existence was some kind of personal failure. The humiliation began at the annual family brunch. Everyone was gathered at the sprawling estate of my uncle. Well, sprawling is what it appeared to be to outsiders. To me, it was just another venue where I was consistently mocked. I arrived in my modest dress, carrying a small tote bag with my lunch. The moment I stepped into the marble-floored foyer, the whispers began. "Oh, look who decided to show up," my cousin Rachel hissed, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing toward me as she chuckled. "Still living like a pauper, I see." I forced a polite smile, nodding in acknowledgement. "Hello, everyone," I said softly, as though my words could somehow dissolve the tension in the air. My aunt, who had a reputation for delivering subtle verbal jabs, leaned forward and said, "Darling, don't you think it's time you got a real job? Or at least a car that isn't falling apart?" The laughter that followed wasn't malicious. It was smug, self-satisfied. They were all convinced of their superiority. They didn't know, of course, that while they were flaunting their designer suits and flashy jewelry, I was playing the long game. "You're looking well, considering," my uncle said, his words dripping with thinly veiled judgment. "Still living in that little apartment downtown?" I nodded again, calm as ever. "It's cozy," I said. Inside, I was smiling, because I knew a secret they could never imagine. They thought my life was simple, almost pitiful. What they didn't know was that I was quietly safeguarding something worth millions, a trust fund and inheritance that had been left in my name, under the careful oversight of a lawyer who had instructed me to live modestly until I reached the right age. The fortune wasn't just money. It was a leverage, a shield, and a silent promise of vindication. Rachel laughed again, tossing her blonde hair back. "I honestly don't know how you survive like this," she said. "Do you even know how to live in the real world?" The irony was exquisite. She had no idea that every penny I spent was measured, calculated, and preserved. Every modest meal, every secondhand item, every frugal choice wasn't because I couldn't afford more. It was because I couldn't touch the inheritance yet. The moment I did, the world she flaunted with its superficial displays of wealth would pale in comparison to what I controlled. I joined the conversation as best I could, speaking with courtesy, laughter in my voice. That masked a simmering satisfaction. They continued mocking my apartment, my wardrobe, even the bicycle I rode to work. But in every joke, every sneer, I stored fuel. Every comment reminded me why patience was necessary, why silence was more powerful than rebuttal. The afternoon dragged on. They passed around stories of luxury vacations, new cars, and the latest tech gadget. I listened, nodding politely, all the while keeping my secret close. My uncle bragged about his investments, clearly proud of his financial genius. Rachel went on about the designer handbag she had bought that morning. Even my parents, who should have been on my side, exchanged amused glances, clearly enjoying my discomfort. And yet, through all of this, I felt no shame. In fact, I felt a strange sense of control. They had no idea that the very fortune they assumed I had no access to was accumulating silently, untouchable, but growing exponentially in value. I had been following the advice of the lawyer meticulously. Live simply, stay frugal, avoid attention, and protect the assets until the right moment arrived. When they teased me about my lack of engagement in the family business, about how I didn't attend gala dinners or network at expensive events, I only smiled. "Some of us choose different priorities," I said lightly, letting my words float past them like a harmless breeze. They took it as humility, maybe even insecurity. They didn't know that I had priorities they could never comprehend: patience, strategy, and the long-term accumulation of power. By the time dessert arrived, a rich chocolate ganache that smelled divine, I had made a mental note of every slight, every laugh, every dismissive glance. It all went into my internal ledger, a mental record of the day they treated me as insignificant. Every word would serve as fuel for the moment when the truth of my inheritance would become undeniable. And then came the moment that would have marked my humiliation as complete. Rachel, in a fit of self-satisfied arrogance, leaned over and said, "You know, it must be hard seeing everyone else living the life you could never have. Some of us are just born with the world in our hands." I paused. My fork hovered over my dessert. I met her gaze calmly. "Perhaps," I said softly, letting the words linger like a shadow in the sunlit room. "Or perhaps some of us are just learning patience and the rewards it brings." She laughed dismissively, clearly assuming I was deflecting. But inside, I was smiling. The inheritance, the $1 million trust, the asset portfolio, they were mine to control. And one day, the people who mocked my simple life would realize just how wrong they had been. As the brunch wound down, I made my excuses and left quietly. They waved, still smirking, still convinced that I was insignificant. I stepped outside, the sunlight warm against my skin, and felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. They had mocked me, judged me, and dismissed me, but all of that would change. The foundation of my plan was patience. The fortune had been protected, untouched, growing quietly. I had waited for the moment when my maturity, my understanding, and the legal parameters would allow me to access it. I had played the long game, and every slight they threw at me had only reinforced the precision of my strategy. That evening, as I rode my bicycle home through quiet streets, I thought about the future. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was leverage, power, and justice. And when the time came to reveal it, the people who laughed at me, who called my life insignificant, would see the reality of their assumptions. I had been underestimated, mocked, and dismissed, but I had never been weak. I had been building, protecting, and preparing. And soon, the world that had laughed at me would witness a transformation they could never have imagined. Because the simple life I lived was never simple at all. It was deliberate, strategic, and shielded by patience. And the day they discovered the truth, the laughter and mockery would fall silent. After that humiliating brunch, I returned to my modest apartment with a calm determination. The laughter, the whispers, the subtle jabs, they all became fuel, not frustration. While my family and cousins lived in a world of ostentation, I lived in one of preparation. My inheritance wasn't just money, it was power in waiting, and I had to approach it with patience and precision. For weeks, I immersed myself in the details of the trust fund. The lawyer had given me a roadmap: invest wisely, avoid reckless expenditures, and protect the assets until I reached the age where full control would be legally mine. Most people would have been tempted to splurge the instant they had access to even a fraction of the fortune. I refused. Every financial statement, every portfolio adjustment, every market analysis became part of my education. I started small. I learned about stocks, bonds, real estate, and business ventures. I read every book I could get my hands on about wealth management, leadership, and strategic planning. I created spreadsheets to track everything, not just for myself, but to anticipate the moves of others. I knew that some of my relatives would eventually become greedy, opportunistic, or careless. I needed to be ready. Meanwhile, I maintained the appearance of a simple, inconspicuous life. My bicycle remained my primary mode of transport. My wardrobe was modest, my apartment humble. I continued to work at the library, quietly observing the world and learning about human behavior. Every encounter I had, every judgment passed on me, became data, a blueprint for the eventual revelation of my power. I began to subtly test the waters. When my cousin Rachel bragged about a new luxury handbag during a casual visit, I complimented it politely but said, "You know, some of the best investments don't come in leather or gold. They come in ideas and patience." She laughed and waved it off. Little did she know, she had just been given a hint of the philosophy that would soon reshape her understanding. My aunt, ever critical of my modest life, began to notice small changes. I started donating anonymously to charities she valued. The amounts weren't enormous yet, but they were enough to cause subtle confusion. "Why is she so quiet about her generosity?" she whispered to my mother at a family gathering. They didn't suspect that every donation came from careful, controlled allocations from my trust, decisions I made not for recognition, but to quietly demonstrate that I wasn't powerless. While everyone else focused on appearances, I focused on influence. I began attending local business seminars, networking quietly with financial advisors, lawyers, and even real estate agents. I learned about negotiation tactics, asset protection, and wealth expansion strategies. The irony was delicious. While my family mocked my simple life, I was quietly building connections that would secure my dominance once the inheritance became mine. The turning point came when I started evaluating potential acquisitions, real estate, small businesses, investment opportunities, anything that could grow the wealth and position me strategically. I didn't rush. I couldn't. Every move had to be calculated. Every risk had to be measured. Patience, after all, was the key. I often reminded myself of that as I watched my cousins flaunt their material wealth. Impatience was their weakness, and it was my advantage. Months passed, and my low-profile approach began yielding results. Investments made in small, overlooked businesses started returning dividends. I learned how to leverage resources, reinvest profits, and maintain liquidity. My network expanded, but I remained anonymous. Nobody in the family suspected that the quiet, unassuming relative they had mocked was actually a sophisticated strategist quietly shaping her empire. Then came the social event that would mark the next stage of my plan. My cousin Rachel's engagement party. She had insisted on hosting it at a lavish venue, inviting everyone in our extended family, and naturally, I was included. I arrived as usual, inconspicuous, simple, unassuming. The moment I entered, the whispers started. "Still the same," someone remarked. "She doesn't even dress up." Rachel, glowing in her expensive gown, spotted me and rolled her eyes. "She looks like she just walked off the street," she whispered to her fiancé. I smiled politely and found a quiet corner to observe. While they were consumed by extravagance, I analyzed everything: the vendors, the security, the guest list, even the budget, which had been boasted about as astronomical. I realized just how inefficient and overpriced everything was. Their attention to luxury had blinded them to practical realities and to opportunities. That night, I made the key decision. I would gain influence quietly, not through confrontation, but through strategy. I began approaching select vendors after the party, negotiating contracts, suggesting improvements, and subtly building a reputation as someone who could manage wealth and resources intelligently. They didn't know it yet, but the woman they mocked would soon have the power to oversee events like these, and many more, with a skill they lacked entirely. Meanwhile, I continued living simply. I cycled to work, cooked my meals, and avoided ostentation. People still laughed at my life, assuming I was powerless, but every act of simplicity was part of my disguise. While they spent frivolously, I saved, invested, and expanded my influence quietly, invisibly, inexorably. By the end of the year, the results were clear. My portfolio had grown substantially. I had begun buying small shares in local businesses, some of which my family frequented. I had even purchased a few properties under anonymous accounts. Everything was building toward a single goal: the day I would reveal my control, my wealth, and my authority. And that day would come sooner than they expected. Because the people who mocked my simple life didn't realize one crucial thing: simplicity is deceptive. They saw a quiet, frugal young woman, unaware that she was protecting a fortune, cultivating influence, and preparing to demonstrate that patience, intelligence, and restraint were far more powerful than reckless display. When the time came, they would see everything. The million-dollar inheritance wouldn't just be revealed, it would be leveraged. Every insult, every laugh, every moment of mockery would be overturned by the undeniable truth. The person they thought was powerless had been orchestrating an empire under their noses all along, and the revelation would be absolute. By the time my 25th birthday arrived, the quiet life I had led was no longer just about discretion. It had become a strategy. Every action I had taken over the past several years, every frugal choice, every overlooked investment, Every connection I had carefully nurtured was now converging. I was no longer the girl my family mocked. I was the architect of a quiet empire that even they could not imagine. It all started with the properties. I had acquired several through anonymous accounts, small at first, almost invisible, but over time, their values appreciated exponentially. I focused on properties with potential for growth, undervalued locations with strong rental yield, and businesses that could be turned around with strategic oversight. I knew that wealth was not just money, it was influence, control, and the ability to act without interference. Then came the businesses. Using the funds I had patiently accumulated, I purchased stakes in local shops, restaurants, and event management companies. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed, "Look at me." Each investment was carefully calculated, each one serving as a puzzle piece that would eventually create a network of influence across the city. Meanwhile, my family continued their performances of superiority. Rachel posted pictures of lavish trips, designer clothes, and fancy dinners. My aunts and uncles bragged about new cars, yachts, and holiday homes. They were living in a world of instant gratification, unaware that their lives were built on debts, poor investments, and a lack of foresight. And all the while, I remained quiet, observant, and patient. The first ripple of change came subtly. Vendors who had once laughed at me, assuming I was just another quiet relative with nothing to offer, started reaching out for my advice. The restaurant where Rachel had hosted her engagement party contacted me about cost-saving measures and efficiency improvements. The boutique she frequented asked for guidance on inventory management. My reputation was quietly spreading, still under the radar, still unnoticed by my family. Then, one evening, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. My family had been planning a large estate auction, a chance to sell off some properties and collectibles that were supposedly too complicated to manage. They had invited appraisers, lawyers, and potential buyers, and naturally, I was invited as well. I arrived as usual, understated, calm, and attentive. My family barely acknowledged me, assuming I would remain irrelevant to the proceedings. But as the auction progressed, I quietly observed every detail: the underpricing of items, the inefficiency of the auction house, and the lack of strategic thinking. I saw opportunities where others saw chaos. After the auction, I approached the auction house owner. "I think we could structure these sales differently," I suggested, almost as a casual remark. "It would maximize profits and ensure smoother transactions." He looked at me with skepticism, expecting another naive comment from the poor cousin. But I presented my analysis, backed with data and projections. Within minutes, he was nodding, clearly impressed. Within weeks, I was managing several high-value sales for other clients, including some of my own family's assets, all without revealing the full extent of my resources. The tipping point came when I finally gained control of the inheritance. Every year, the funds had grown quietly, compounded through careful investments and prudent management. I now had full access, and with it, the leverage I had been waiting for. But I didn't rush. My goal was not just wealth, it was a demonstration, a calculated reveal that would leave my family astounded. I started with subtle moves. Businesses they owned began receiving offers for partnerships and buyout. I facilitated some of these deals anonymously, ensuring that my family unknowingly benefited while remaining unaware of my growing influence. They continued to mock me publicly, assuming that my quiet life equated to powerlessness. Meanwhile, I was building networks, acquiring assets, and preparing for the moment of revelation. And then, the first real confrontation occurred. My cousin Rachel called me in a panic. "I don't understand it," she said. "Our boutique's profits are stagnating, and our accountant says the solution comes from someone like you." I stayed calm. "I can help," I said softly, "but you have to trust my methods." She was desperate and had no choice but to comply. Within weeks, her boutique was profitable again. The irony was delicious. The same cousin who had mocked my modest life was now dependent on my expertise. Then, one evening, I received a call from my aunt. She had overheard a conversation about strategic property investments and wanted my advice. "I think I underestimated you," she admitted hesitantly. I didn't realize how much you actually know," I smiled quietly. It's not about knowing, I said. It's about patience, observation, and timing. By now, whispers had begun circulating among my relatives. People started noticing that the quiet, simple cousin was making impactful moves behind the scenes. Businesses were thriving, properties were managed efficiently, and anonymous donations were appearing in charitable circles. My family began to sense that their assumptions had been wrong, but they had no idea just how wrong. And then came the final preparation. I consolidated my holdings, transferred assets to centralized accounts, and established control over the properties that had once belonged to my family. Every investment, every transaction, every move had been calculated to ensure that when the reveal came, it would be undeniable and inescapable. The day of the reveal approached quietly. I organized a small family gathering under the guise of a casual celebration. Invitations were extended, and my family assumed it was just another polite get-together. They dressed in their finest clothes, smirking as they anticipated the usual humble appearance I would make. I arrived as expected. Simple attire, modest demeanor, but my eyes carried a quiet confidence. This was the night everything would change, because the person they had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated was no longer powerless. I had orchestrated a network of influence, accumulated wealth, and learned the art of control. And soon my family would see that the quiet life I had led was not a sign of weakness, but the careful preparation of someone who was about to redefine the rules entirely. The stage was set, the empire was built, and the people who had called me worthless at 18 were about to witness the full extent of their mistake. The day had arrived. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every element of the setting carefully orchestrated. My family believed this gathering was just another casual get-together, a celebration of birthdays, anniversaries, or some inconsequential family milestone. They had no idea that tonight, everything would change. I arrived at the family estate with calm confidence, dressed simply but with an air of authority. No flashy jewelry, no designer clothing, just presence. They greeted me with polite nods and some concealed smirks, expecting their old familiar routine. The quiet cousin, the modest life, the powerless observer. They were wrong. The living room had been arranged for a subtle presentation. I had set up a projector, prepared documents, and coordinated with my legal and financial advisors to be ready. Every family member was seated comfortably, chatting, sipping drinks, oblivious to what was about to unfold. I cleared my throat, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice calm but commanding. I wanted us to gather to celebrate family and to share some important news. There was a brief murmur, interest peaked, but no one suspected the gravity of what I was about to reveal. I clicked a button, and the projector illuminated the wall with the first slide, a detailed overview of the assets, investments, and properties I had quietly accumulated over the past 7 years. Names, addresses, portfolios, financial statements. It was all there. Documented, verifiable, undeniable. Gasps filled the room. My cousin Rachel's jaw dropped. My aunt clutched her pearls. Even my uncle's usually confident posture faltered. "This," I continued, gesturing toward the projection, "represents the culmination of years of patience, learning, and strategic planning. All of this," I said, emphasizing the words, "was carefully managed, preserved, and grown under my guidance." The whispers grew louder. "How?" One of my relatives stammered. You had all of this?" "Yes," I said, voice calm and steady. "Every asset, every investment, every property. It was all under my management. And tonight, you're going to learn the full extent of what that means." I handed over folders to my lawyer and financial advisor. "These documents show complete ownership and control. Effective immediately, I am the trustee of the family inheritance, the manager of all associated properties, and the decision-maker for any transactions concerning these assets." The room went silent. My relatives stared at me, their faces contorting through disbelief. And finally, the cousin who had mocked my modest life at 18, Rachel, was staring as if she had seen a ghost. "You," she whispered, pointing at me. You're joking." I shook my head. "No joke, Rachel. You called my life simple and worthless. You laughed at me, assumed I was powerless, and underestimated me. Tonight, I'm showing you that power doesn't announce itself with flashy trips or designer clothes. It grows quietly, strategically, and patiently. I've protected this inheritance, grown it, and now I hold control over it all. My aunt tried to speak, but I raised a hand, gently silencing her. Let me finish. Every investment I made, every property I acquired, every business I nurtured, it was done not to boast, but to ensure that the family's legacy, which was once mismanaged, is now secure. Effective immediately, all decisions regarding these assets will be made by me. Rachel's face turned red. Her earlier smirk vanished entirely. She stammered. You mocked my lifestyle at 18. I said softly, letting the weight of those words sink in. You dismissed me as worthless, incapable, and weak. Tonight, you're witnessing the truth, the quiet life, the patience, the observation. You thought it was nothing, but it was everything. I clicked the projector again, this time revealing a list of accounts and businesses that I had carefully positioned under my control. Every property my family had claimed as theirs, every business they had flaunted, the management, profits, and oversight were now legally under my guidance. The reaction was immediate and visceral. My aunt and uncle whispered frantically, trying to make sense of the situation. My cousin Rachel's hands trembled as she clutched her drink, realizing her financial security had been silently absorbed into my empire. And there's more, I continued, my voice firm but calm. Not only have I grown the inheritance, but I've also ensured that its management is now efficient, profitable, and protected. The assets will continue to grow, secure from mismanagement and short-sighted decisions. This is the power of patience, strategy, and diligence. For the first time, my family looked at me with respect, not mockery, not derision, but genuine acknowledgement of my authority. The tables had turned. The ones who had mocked my modest life, laughed at my frugality, and dismissed my intelligence were now facing the undeniable proof of my competence. Rachel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I never imagined. I know, I said, letting a small, calm smile cross my face. That's the point. You underestimated me because you judged me by appearances. Tonight, you've learned that appearances can be deceiving. The quiet, simple life you mocked was a shield, a strategy, and preparation for the responsibilities I now hold. I pause, letting the silence emphasize the shift in power. My relatives were speechless, processing the reversal of fortune and influence. Effective immediately, I said, concluding. All decisions regarding family assets, inheritance, and investments will be communicated through me. Any actions taken without my approval will be considered invalid. I have assumed control, not to punish, but to protect and grow what belongs to our family legacy. The room remained silent. Rachel finally lowered her gaze, ashamed. My aunt and uncle were visibly shaken. The rest of the family, who had all whispered behind my back, now looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. And in that moment, I realized the full power of my journey. The girl who had been dismissed as worthless, mocked for her simple life, and underestimated by everyone had not only survived, but had risen to absolute control. I had transformed patience, strategy, and intelligence into influence, respect, and undeniable authority. The best part? My family had learned it not through confrontation or anger, but through action, through careful, deliberate planning. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate the quiet ones, the observers, the strategists. They are the ones who build empires in silence, while others waste time flaunting wealth and status. As the family looked on, finally recognizing the scope of what I had achieved, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The journey had been long, the work relentless, and the lessons harsh, but the result was absolute. I was no longer the powerless relative. I was the architect, the protector, and the ultimate authority. And from that day forward, the family would never again doubt the value, intelligence, or power of the one they had once called simple, worthless, and powerless.